Hey, John, what's your mother? Okay, sweet, that works. It's not to the point where I when they say first minute, so then because they're referring to.
So is there a way to full screen his?
There is not a way to full screen this thing. There you go. You do this thing. What you say? You can also have that bottom bar. You gotta lock which one is.
And like presentation. Oh, am I still not muted?
Yeah. There you go. That's pretty good. You can kind of just drop.
If you zoom out all the way,
Feedback, Haven.
say something else. Zoom out all the way in Google Play.
Do you have mic on yours? Is your mic on? Sure your mic's on.
Yeah. Let me mute. Say it again. We good?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, in talking about topics, we decided that we could talk about performance, and that's a thing that when you first like run into Angular and you're like, dude, this is amazing compared to what I used to use, and whatever it was that you used to use, Angular is pretty amazing. For your first few months, I mean, even your first year, you're just like, you know, you're blown away by the velocity you're able to get. And once you get into an app that's got, you know, 60, 70,000, 80,000 lines of your own code, you start to see some problems with Angular. And I work at a company called Domo. It's a big business intelligence company in Salt Lake City. And we have around 120,000 lines of code in our single page. It's a single page app, so it's a pretty big payload. And we run into performance issues a lot. Angular does some things that makes our life really awesome, but it also makes life really sucky. So one of the things we had to do to get over these big problems was to talk about what does Angular do. and specifically what is a digest. And so a lot of times we don't understand what a digest is, and when you don't understand like some of the deets, and you don't really understand how to play with it and test the performance, you're not really sure how to make your app scream or to get some of the performance back from Angular. So I wanted to spend some time talking about digests and watchers specifically. So a lot of this, we're going to be like, dude, I already knew that. But there's some nuances that we're going to learn along the way that hopefully will get us into a better place as we're writing code in Angular. And a lot of these will feel like micro optimizations, but as you're coding every single day, if every time you're laying down the tracks, you're micro optimizing everything you're doing, those turn into big optimizations on the long run in your app. You'll definitely notice it when you get down the road a little bit. So I wrote a little Angular app that's the slides and the code at the same time. So what's the #1 way to improve the performance of your Angular app? Does anyone know? ngperf, yeah. You just put that directive on and everything gets faster. Yeah, so what's the #1 way? It's not ngperf. How cool would that be, though, right? What's that? Speed up the digest. So I'm going to say that in a different way. Less watchers, right? So that's the key. As an Angular developer, that's one of our main goals, is to use the least amount of watches as possible. Okay, and when we get into when we start learning Angular, we learn all these cool directives like show and hide and if and clicks and all the event listeners, and you're like, wow, this is really cool, and like templating, and we get really complex with our templating, and then like we start learning filters, and a few months later we've got like an ng repeat that uses a method to get to things, and then pipes those results through like a filter, and then pipes that filter result through another filter or two, and you've got so many watchers just to do something that's probably you could have done with Lodash and a few lines of code. But we're being good Angular citizens, though, right? Like Angular gave us the filter, and they gave us the things to do it, so why not use Angular to do it? And so I wanted to kind of talk about it. So when we look at this code, and let me open up my DevTools real quick. Sorry, let me make my DevTools bigger. You can see that? Are my DevTools okay though? All right. Let me turn this. Sorry.
Say again?
Do you not have to hold the mic?
No. Yes. Sure. You want to show me how it's done?
Yeah. I always hold the mic.
I need a coat hanger.
Okay. So when we look at this value, I mean this value clearly came from my controller. If we pull up the code, I have a start controller here, and in my template, it's got the this. Here's my watcher, and then it's got this value that comes from my controller. When we look at the controller, it says this value comes from the controller, and it ends up on the page, right? Like that's kind of the templating thing. That's the cool thing, right? So what that does is, and I'm going to use battering. Do you guys all use battering, and do you consider yourself like battering gurus? Okay, good. DevTools have been being weird. I can't click on. Yeah, got it. So if we look at this guy, like if I inspect this controller, how cool do I look like How cool do I look right now?
Oh shit.
Way cool, right?
Yeah, I got you.
I
got you for real.
So when we look at this scope, like when you inspect it with battering, it goes ahead and it gives you like a global scope variable that you can talk to. And if we look at our scope, Sorry, let's get this to you a little bit bigger so you guys can see it better. We have this $$ on our scope. This, let me type, I promise. We have this watchers dude sitting on our scope. So these are our watchers that we have on our scope right now, okay? So we have 2 watchers on our current scope. So the first watcher evaluated to nothing, and our second watcher evaluated to 1. Am I on the right bloody thing? Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so on this scope, we have 1 watcher, and it's just that 1 value that we talked about, okay? So this is the thing that Angular uses to digest. This little watcher object, we've got hundreds of these things, thousands of these things on every page, and when Angular goes through to digest, when we hear that word, the digest cycle, it's coming through each scope and it's picking up these watchers, okay, and it's going to evaluate them and see what it needs to do with them. So when we look at this watcher for this, all I did was template in a string here. It has the last value, so that when it checks to see the current value, it can compare it to the last value and see if it's changed, and then if it does, it freaks out and does this function right here, which will go ahead and re-update it in the DOM, right? So that's kind of how you get the two-way data binding out of it. So it creates it goes ahead and it peppers your scopes with these watcher objects, and that's how it knows all the things that it has to do when it's going through the digest cycle. Go ahead.
How did that get added? Just because the controller list setting?
Yeah, so in my code, I just use this template right here. I just use the double curly braces and specified my variable on my scope, and then over in my controller, I just have that string in there, my var.
Just because of that binding, it just
yeah. So when you add that binding up, now your scope gets this watchers thing. So if there's no watchers, the value of watchers is null. So it's not an empty array; it's just null. But once you get 1 or more watchers, yeah. Did you have a question right there?
Yeah. So just by putting something in scope, you get default watchers without actually using $watch.
So by putting something on the scope in my controller, so if I came over here to my controller and I just started adding, scope.foo, scope.bar, scope.pass, and they were just nonsense variables, that's not going to create a watcher. Okay? It's when I go to my view and I say, hey, bind yourself here back to my controller. That's when you're going to get a watcher. Because it doesn't care about the other variable. If you put a function on your scope and that function's not getting called anywhere in your view, Angular doesn't care. And so to be efficient, they prune those out and they remove the watchers on those. So yeah, good question though. I had that same question and I was like, what if I put 45 things on here? Do I get 45 watchers? And the answer is no. It's only the ones that you're going to use. Yeah.
It's any directive that was making use of scope that was bound to the scope would have the same issue, right?
A directive, yeah, directive is going to have multiple watchers per directive, even if it's a simple directive. And we can go ahead and code one up just so you guys can kind of see how many directives you got. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try something out here on the screen just so you guys can kind of see how the watchers get affected, okay? So one of my friends, his name's Michael Bailey. We call him Viper. If you meet him, call him Viper. He doesn't really like to be called Michael or Bailey. So Viper, he built this thing called Show Angular Stats. So I'm going to show it to you guys. My friend Kent kind of took what Viper did and made it into a directive that you can use. It's a lot easier. So I'm going to just type in here Show Angular Stats. It's a method call. And it puts this canvas up here in the corner. You guys can't really see it, and I'm sorry for that. But it's got a 0.49 up here, and it's in green. So that means my current digest cycle takes 0.49 milliseconds. Okay? So I'm not even at a millisecond yet, which is really good, right? Like, if all the digest cycles on this 100,000 lines of code took 0 milliseconds, like, you need to go work at Google and show them what you're doing because that's epic. So it also tells us we have 15 watchers in our whole app. Okay? And in a little bit, I'm going to show you guys a piece of code that really isn't super uncommon, and we're going to have thousands of watchers. Okay? And you're going to see the digest cycle like spike through the roof, and I did it on purpose just so you guys can kind of see. It gets insane fast. So I'm going to go ahead and I want to just take this out real quick. Just so you guys, I just want to like prove to you. So when I save this, here, let's turn on live reload so it live reloads it. So that's gone now, right, that template? And if we show the Angular stats, we just lost 3 watchers, right? So I only had 1 binding and I lost 3 watchers. Is that kind of insane? Yeah, so sometimes it creates multiple watchers per template that you guys lay down, per tracks that you got there and lay down in your template, in your view. And if you're using directives, you're like, dude, I just used my ng crazy directive. How come I got 400 bindings? And it's like, ng crazy has got a lot of, you must have done something insane in there. So just by removing that, we lost 3 watchers. So that's kind of intense, right?
Yeah, question.
Yeah.
What's worse than having a directive and ng repeat?
What's worse than having a directive and ng repeat?
Yep.
Having an ng repeat inside that same directive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything worse than that? In
What's
terms of creating watchers.
Yeah, no, not really. Well, that's pretty bad. So yeah. But we all have to do it, right? Like I'm not saying, hey, finger wag to you if you've got a repeat and a repeat. I'm mad at you. Like we all have to do it, right? We all have to loop inside of loops. It's not a bad thing, even though we make jokes about it as programmers. People who loop in loops are bad, but we all have to, right? Like it's inevitable. That's what the designers made the UI look like, and that's what we had to code it with. So we did. So it's not bad. There are things you can do to make it more efficient, though. So and understanding these little watchers, they're just these little objects that when it forces a digest, it's going to go through and look at each one, and it's going to say, did it change? If it did, it's going to call the change function on that watcher to update. Like it kind of wires up that function ahead of time to say, you just run this, and it goes ahead and re-updates the bindings between the UI and the model. So that's kind of what's going on there. Does anyone have any questions so far before I keep going? All right. So another way that you can look at these bindings, if you don't want to use showing you their stats in Batarang, let me get it. Come on. Is anyone else having the same problem with their Chrome? Okay, there we go. So if we turn Chrome on, or sorry, if we enable this Batarang thing, we'll go over here and we can come to our performance, and it'll show us all of our different watchers that we have. Okay, and it will show us what they evaluate to. So this intercepted expression, what do you guys think that is? That's a string. I don't know why it shows that, but it does. So that's what you wired some of them down. These other things where you tied it to a model, somewhere in your model, it actually shows you the path. I don't know why this intercepted expression shows up, but it does. So these are some other ways you can come in and you can look at it. And down here on the bottom, it actually shows you when Brian Ford built this. He actually built this when he was an intern. Did you guys know that? This is like his project as an intern on the Angular team, was Batarang. Down here at the bottom, it actually shows you your slowest watchers. So when you're like, hey, why does this page suck? How come I type a key, when I key press, my Chrome dies? Like what's going on? The watch expressions over here can help you understand what's going on. Okay, so this is a good tool to use, and it tells you of your digest cycle, this one took up 54.6% of your digest cycle, and it took 0.8 milliseconds, which I wish that was the worst one, right? So, but you can also, like, if you're like, hey, just show me the really bad ones, because maybe you have thousands, and this page, because when you open this page in a big app, this extension over here really, really starts to drag. So you can set up some filters and say, hey, just give me like the really, really bad ones, and then you can kind of focus on those ones and knock those off and figure out where they're coming from. One thing I learned from Brian when I was using this page is sometimes when you do like a manual watch, I'm going to code it up real quick. Sometimes when we do a watch, we don't name our watch functions, right? We just use an anonymous function in our watch statement. So he names his, and the reason he does that is because when it shows up over here and in his call stack, you can understand which anonymous function it was when you name it. So let me go ahead and code that up real quick just so you guys can see what that would be, what that would look like. So if you wire up your watch function like this, in that call stack over there, it will actually, instead of just showing function and you're like, well, what the heck? I don't care that it's an anonymous function. Which bloody line of code was it on? If you name them like this, you can actually see it in your call stack, and you can also see it in that first page as well. Yeah.
Have you had these issues with browser compatibility with naming functions? For IE and maybe old Safari, that's an issue? Like exploding?
I could be lucky. We don't support all the way back like some people do, so we haven't ever had that problem. But you guys might, so hopefully you don't. Have you?
I haven't actually done it myself. From what I've read, the practice was discouraged in some places.
Okay. So either you can use this same anonymous syntax and you do it in line and name it there, or you can just put it, do your named function over here and pass it in. You know what I'm saying? So those are your two options, but it'll make it easier to read that performance tab. So when you get in there and you're like, what is all this anonymous function rubbish? Start naming your watcher functions and you'll get it. Like, it'll start to make sense. So there's that. So if you're not using these tools in Batarang, it's a good time to start. Yeah, I'm not going to talk about the other stuff because that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about performance specifically. So, any other questions before we move on? I saw some hands that I was ignoring.
Just repeat the questions when they ask me where I can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a difference between a manual watch and having a bound scope watch?
So is there a difference between a manual watch, like the one I just made, and a bound one where you bound it from the view? Given my knowledge, I'm going to say no. I mean, there is obviously a difference, but like as far as me and you trying to count up the number of watches we got, no. Like you want to reduce those as much as possible. So, okay. So yeah, so if you want to look at the watchers, you can just open up Batarang, look at your scope, and it's the $$ watchers array. So I explained that they have the last value, and that's what the digest cycle does. Like that's what it looks like when it's going to go through and say, did it change from the last time I looked? And if it is different, then it goes through and reruns the function that's on the watcher. If you guys want to look at the ng-stats object, we actually at Domo, we actually have ng-stats in our build. And for production, when we ship to production, it takes it out. Like our grunt build doesn't include it in our production build, but for development, it's actually there. So if you guys wanted to look at that, ng-stats, actually it's on Kent C. Dog's GitHub. So if you guys want to head over there, and again, this was made by my buddy Viper, and it's been really helpful. So at any time when you have a really slow page, you just go into your console and say show Angular stats, and you can see right there kind of what's going on. Like maybe you wired up like a hover event, which you should never do, but maybe you did. And you're like, well, it's really slow. It's because you wired up a hover event. So So yeah, like they can kind of help you with those kind of things. So ng-stats. Any other questions on that? So let's go ahead and add a couple watchers just so we can kind of see, we can kind of watch it increase as we're going. So just so we can kind of like get some hands-on, this is how watchers increase. So let's go ahead and template this in 1 second.
Aaron, if you put another, if you found the same variable slice in the template, does that add another watch?
Yeah. Yeah. It has to add another watch because it needs another function to update that part of the DOM because it's updating a different section, right? It's not the same element that it's bound to. It's bound to a different element now. So, good question. And one might be an input, and you update that differently than you would like a span putting text in it, right? So. Okay, so I'm going to go to my controller, and you guys have some random thing we can put in there? Engage rocks, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and put this new val over into our DOM. New val, and when we refresh, engage rocks is there, and if we look up here, we just got a whole bunch more watchers. We got 3 more watchers on that. So just by putting a string in there, if we come to our controller and we say scope.nums equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So how many watchers do you think we're going to get off this interview? 1? Someone's at 32. He's thinking. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this real quick. Span, and we'll say ng repeat. We'll say num in nums. Num. Okay. So how many numbers did I have? 5, right?
Plus 1, right?
And plus 1 for the directive, you're saying?
So to keep track of the number of elements that are there.
Okay. Well, let's see how many we got. So we went from 18 to 26. So that's 8, right? So we got 5 plus 3 more. So that's awesome. That's exactly what everyone here guessed. So it doesn't do like the exact number of bindings that you did. Sometimes it adds a couple extra, and you guys are gonna say, why does it do that? Well, probably some random bug for Safari. I don't know the answer, but it is more than the number of templates that you're using. That's all you need to know. So it's kind of close, but it is more than what you're using. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So kind of I'm going to stop talking about watchers at this point and maybe go a little bit more into like the full digest cycle and kind of explain what's going on there. So I threw some tweet bait out here so you guys can tweet me on this. If you have a watcher that takes more than 1 millisecond, it's not going to scale. So you asked about repeats. Like, do you have a watcher? So maybe you're binding to a function. You're saying, put the result of this function in here. If that's going to take more than 1 millisecond, then that's not going to scale. And we'll show you some examples here. Like if you have a filter that takes more than 1 millisecond to filter, and you have more than 40 of those objects, I mean, your digest cycle just went to 40 milliseconds per digest. You know what I'm saying? So yeah.
Filter functions execute multiple times per digest.
All of these. Okay. So it's kind of like an ocean, man. Like sometimes when this goes up over here, this other part goes back up. So the digest cycle, it rechecks and rechecks and rechecks, and it caps itself. It's like, don't infinitely check.
Yeah, that's how you get the.
And that's how you're going to get it. Yeah. And so don't just sit there. Like if the developer said change this and that changes that, but that changes the thing that just changed, then the developer's dumb. And we're only going to do it like 10 times, and then we're going to jump ship.
Yeah.
So it tries to. I mean, it will, and that's not really saving you from yourself because really you have a bug. But they're not going to just sit there and like force you into like to kill your tab in Chrome. So, so yeah, like so sometimes it does have to go through and check because like it processes this like maybe this parent scope and all of its children, and then it comes over here and it sees that that changes this. Okay, well I have to go check everything else again to make sure that they don't need to redigest again. So it is like super reactive, and so Yeah, like if you put a console log in your filter functions, you're like, it should have only digested that one time. Why did it call it 20 times? You're like, because it's just there's a lot of reaction in your the way your stuff's set up. Yeah.
There are ways to tell Angular to kind of control that, the way that digest rechecks, to streamline it for it in cases where you know that you recheck something or everything built in. I'm guessing the answer.
So in Angular 3.1.3, so all of us. So the question was, is there a way to tell Angular to not freak out and digest the entire bloody app just because I changed this one thing over here? Because the reality is, if you bind to like an input and you type in it, that's a change. It pushed it to the model, and the whole app just digests. So that can be kind of poor performance. And so, but that is the reality of Angular. Like that's the thing that we all fell in love with. Like in the very first demo, they like bound an input, and then they bound it to the DOM, and as we typed, it friggin' appeared in the span, and we were like, I'm in love with this, you know. And then like they reversed the string, and we were like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna use this forever. And so like that's what we fell in love with. But that's that same thing that we like. That's really the thing that's killing us too. Like when you get into a big app, that's what's killing you, because for every single scope you get, that's like one more chance it has to go re-dirty check when it does that. So every single scope you're adding, that's just one more like depth in the tree of scopes it has to check. And we'll look at this, the digest method here in a minute. Yeah.
Isn't there another model
Yeah, so I'm actually going to go through some enhancements that we can do. I'm just for right now. So the question was, isn't there some directives we can use to make that not happen? And that is a great question, and that's kind of when we get to a big app, we're like, there's got to be something I can do, and we all look for what the answer to that is, and I'll show that off in a second. So let me go on to this next section. So yeah, the dirty check cycle, the digest cycle, whatever you want to call it, it's this thing, right? And we just talked about it, where it's like it doesn't ever stop. It seems like it's just doing the same thing over and circularly over, and it's just a cycle that never ends. I mean, it's doing it in like milliseconds, but this is literally what's happening. It's just doing the same thing again and again and again. And it's the best and the worst part of Angular, and they know that. Anyone here, has everyone heard about Object.Observe? Right, like some people have a lot of stock invested that will change the way, like the speed of Angular, and Mishka did some check, like he had tried to implement it, and instead of checking for changes in JavaScript, Object.Observe lets you kind of wire that up in native code, so in C++. So your dirty checking can happen fundamentally in a different way, like in a different level, and it can be way faster. So some people think that's the answer to some of the performance in Angular.
But still, even that can have a limit, right?
And yeah, but
only go.
Yeah, that's only going to get you so far. Like you can still, and maybe that makes your app work better on desktop, but on mobile you still might not see a performance improvement at all, because it's a simpler device. So even though it's using like a better way, it still can have good performance. And other people like see React and they're like, hey, the virtual DOM is the way to go. And so it kind of like depends on where you think the performance really is at. So in Angular 1.3 though, they've implemented some new things. They've got this, it's called fast path pruning. So when it goes through and digests all the scopes, they're using more intelligence in the way that they say, I don't need to go back down that path again. Like, this thing is good, so it will speed up the digest cycles. So they've got some stuff like that. They also have some other things that we'll talk about. But anyway, yeah, I just wanted to show off this is your digest cycle again and again and again and again and again. So, did I not wire this up? So let's do an ng hover on this guy, and I don't even know what I was going to do here. Let's go look at it. Yeah, go ahead. That's ugly.
Let me see if it works.
Developers. All right. Can you guys hear me? That looks so cool. I haven't felt this cool since I used my Google Glass for the first time. Does anyone here have Google Glass? Okay, good. I wrote this in the middle of the night, I can tell now. Add a hover to this list. All right, I'll add a hover to this list. Okay. That's probably what I wanted to do, right? Yeah. So let's go ahead and investigate this and see what's going on here. So yeah, I'm going to skip this example because I don't even know what I was trying to prove there. Sorry, guys. So yeah, we talked about the rolling changes being like your worst enemy, right? Like it changes here, which is going to force us over here. And when you get a really big app, that can kind of suck. That can be like the worst thing ever. So I wanted to go ahead and look at the digest cycle with you guys, like so we can kind of understand what's going on in the code in Angular. So I think a lot of us don't dare to open up Angular and kind of get in there and maybe even consider doing a pull request. But this is your digest cycle right here that we're going to look at. So they hoisted all their own variables, which is awesome. They begin the phase, which, has anyone ever checked to see if scope.phase exists? And if it doesn't, then you do a scope apply, right? Like that's what we do, right? Okay. And that doesn't always work though, right? So you have to like wrap that in a try catch sometimes. Yeah. Okay. So we're seeing eye to eye then. Do you know the way to get around that though?
No.
If you,
Well, the way it is change by design.
So if you just put your code inside a dollar timeout with a 0 delay, then you don't have to worry about if there's an apply or not. It'll just go ahead and take care of it. Yeah, I used to have like an elegant, like I felt like it's such a code craftsman when I had my way to detect if there was a phase or not, because it didn't always work. Anyway, yeah, just give up and use the timeout method. Yeah. So that's what I would recommend. Anyway, so it's going to do, so we have a do while. Does everyone see this do while loop? So here's our first loop, okay? And it goes all the way down here. So we got like a 100-line method here. And then we got another while loop after it, which is awesome. Inside of this do while loop, we have this while loop, right? And then we have a named while loop called traverse scope loop. And this is the one who he kind of starts in the root scope, and he just kind of travels down to all the children's scopes, looks at their watchers, see if those values have changed. If they haven't, moves on. If they have, he marks things as dirty again, which forces them to recheck the scope and check other scopes. And anyway, that's what this is doing right here. That's what this big pile of method is doing here. And when you look at some of these variable names, like last, you'll notice that those were the variables on our little watcher objects, right? And so when you get down here into this watch, like remember we had a function So it's going to go ahead and, like, if it sees that it was dirty, it will go ahead and call this function. And if it was just a simple primitive bind, it's a lot easier than these ones if it was like an actual expression that has to evaluate. So this is what your digest loop looks like. So you've got a do while loop with a while loop and another do while loop that it can break out of back into the main do while loop. And then once you're done with that, you've got another while loop, which is like basically saying, well, let everything settle down. Like, let all the waves stop, and then we'll say we're done. Okay, and if you hit like some exception, like infinite digest loop, then go ahead and throw it here. So this is your digest loop. Anyone who wants to kind of understand what's going on with the digest better, jump in here and read it. So one thing that I wanted to, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my slides, so I think I'm just jumping ahead of myself. So so as developers though, so Angular, it causes digests on its own, right? But how do we as developers cause digests? Because if we could avoid a digest, doesn't that sound like a pretty good thing to do, right? Like if you avoided hundreds of digests, that sounds pretty awesome, right? So I wanted to kind of talk about some of the things that we do to cause digest cycles. So we use all the built-in Angular directives, right? And anytime you do any of those, you're causing digest cycle, okay? So anytime on top of this, anytime you, it's really, these are the main ones. And I put these ones here because these are the super, like, offenders, okay? Like, does ng scroll sound like it would ever be a good idea? Like, when I scroll 1 pixel, does it sound like a good idea that I would want it to go dirty check everything? But it was there, like ng scroll was there, and I needed a scroll handler, right? So I used it, right? I didn't think about, oh, every single bloody pixel that I go down is like the code throws up on itself. And I got to sit there and wait, and it looks like I'm in Jane Caven trying to get to scroll, 100 pixels. So these are the worst offenders. Like when I'm just moving my mouse across the screen, literally not interacting with the app at all, a mouse over, enter, or leave, your user didn't even do anything, and you're getting freaking digest cycles. Yeah.
So are you saying if you need handlers for those kinds of things, not use the directives?
So I'm going to show some examples. That's what I did. What you did. The question was, am I suggesting to not use Angular and use something else? And so I'm saying I did that, and I do that, but you guys don't need to do that. It's just what I did because our app is gigantic and performance is a big problem.
Like if I had something like infinite scroll, for example, putting aside questions for you,
yeah.
I need to handle the scroll.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, as you're saying, it doesn't mean I need to check the digest every time I scroll pixel.
So,
but at some point, I'll get to the bottom, only to the digest in order to load.
Yeah. There's one point where mathematically you're going to be like, well, I'm close enough to the bottom, I should go get more things, right? And then once I get them, I should put them in my model and tell the scope to put them in, tell the scope to apply so that it right? So eventually, one time out of all those pixels, I'm going to need to do that. And I'm challenging you to be the developer you should be and make that happen. Don't use ng scroll. Use Cengage custom scroll directive. Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a question? So the question was, if I use scroll in one scope, it only going to affect that scope. And that's your question. So I haven't gotten to play with 1.3 yet. My guess is that Cengage isn't using 1.3. So So I'm not going to talk about the 1.3 answer, okay? I'm going to talk about the 1.2 or 1.1 answer, if that's okay with everybody. So the 1.1 and 1.2 answer is no. It's going to cause a root scope.digest, okay? And I'm going to explain a little bit more about the difference between scope apply and scope digest, okay? And 1.3, it's different. There's a way where you can say only digest from here down. Like don't go up to my parent scopes or to my sibling scopes. Just I'm on the top. Treat me like I'm the root scope and do a digest from here on down. So there's ways you could do that in 1.3. But I don't get to consider that my day job either. Like, we're not going to be on 1.3 anytime soon either. So yeah, does anyone have any questions why these are like not awesome? No? So they're there, you can use them, but my opinion is that they're not awesome.
Actually, I do have one question.
Okay.
Can you think of any common scenarios where you would recommend going through the whole digest loop for an event like that and actually using those directives, or would you say that, like in your experience, you found that you should never use them?
If your app,
Small enough, I guess it'd be okay.
until you get to a certain size, you don't really need to care about a lot of what I'm talking about.
So it's convenience.
Yeah, you guys are big, like Domo, right? Like Domo's big, and I don't know how many lines of code you have running on one page at a time. We have a lot, right? Like a 6-digit number. It doesn't even include our libraries. That's just what we wrote.
However, and I told you about this yesterday, our mind apps run isolated, and so we do a lot of those are really quite small, and so we don't need to worry about those. But I know we do have some maybe potentially some bigger problems with our LPN of main, like TOC. There's a lot more going on there. Potentially there we need to think about things.
Are your mind apps running in an iframe?
Yes, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, yeah, because you're loading a separate version of Angular for each iframe. Like, it gets tough.
We're just trying to crash the browser.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's tough. With Domo, we have a similar thing too. Like when you were explaining that to me on the phone, I was like, he's like explaining what we do at Domo, where we have iframes with little miniature apps running in them, right?
Yeah.
And they're a lot smaller. The code base is a lot smaller, but they still have a massive footprint because they're loading their own version of Angular and some of them jQuery and D3 and stuff like that. So yeah.
So if you have iframes inside of your too, so can you use battering for those iframes so you don't work around?
I don't know, man. So the way we have it set up, we don't actually have to develop in the iframe. We can develop in the mainframe, and then you kind of like publish, and then it's available through like the iframe view, if that makes sense. So when we develop it, we don't develop it like in an iframe. So I don't know if you guys are developing in an iframe, which is
We're doing it as a whole.
Progress happens.
Married to the iframe.
It depends on the team. You are right.
cool. Yeah. Question.
So if your app has a lot of hidden tabs or other hidden views and whatnot, all those hidden areas are in digest, right?
Yeah.
Is
So.
there a way of making it not digest those?
So I'm gonna throw out some suggestions here in a second. So the question was if I'm hiding a bunch of stuff, but inside of that stuff I've got bindings which equate to watchers. Are those watchers being digested? And they're either hidden, but they are bound. So yeah, they're totally being digested every time. That's a good question. I had the exact same question. There's a way to not do that though, and there's a way to reduce the number of those. So I'm going to talk about that. So, there is a concept of a scope apply, which you guys have alluded to. Like maybe I'm doing something in jQuery, and that's not part of Angular. So that handler needs to eventually come back and call scope apply to say, Angular, I did some things you don't know about. Please redigest. Like apply my changes into Angular land. And there's another method that we don't normally use, and that's scope.digest. Okay, scope.digest just says from this scope down, only apply it from here down. Don't go up the tree. Yeah. So you can kind of control that, but I mean,
What's the directive around a jQuery or something?
You could maybe, if you knew it didn't have any ties to anything anywhere, you could consider using scope digest instead of scope apply. But it's not guaranteed. So it is a thing to think about, though. Anyway, yeah, so multiple scopes versus just a single scope and down. So, okay. All right, I'm going to go into some examples of, yeah, so I showed you guys NG stats, ways we can improve our performance, okay?
So I'm just going to say we're at the 10-minute mark
Okay.
before the end of our period, but if people are going to hang around, I don't know. I just want to keep going for a while.
Okay, I'm going to up the font because it's going to be tough to see. Hopefully that helps. That's about as good as a gist is going to do here, though. So I put these all on GitHub gists, so they're there if you guys want to go check them out. By the way, all this code is on my GitHub repo, so if you want to go check it out, it's called ngproof. Traditionally, like, we're like, hey, let's debounce and throttle some of these event handlers because, like, as I'm key pressing, I don't need it to go to the server every single time, right? Like, it doesn't. I don't want it to, every time I hit a key, maybe wait 500 milliseconds after I stop typing that. So we use these debounce and throttle methods, right, if we're using underscore or low dash, right? So I kind of wanted to explain what's going to happen in here because it's not what I initially thought it was when I started doing this. So over here, you have this mouse move. So anytime I move my mouse over this controller area, it's going to call this do mouse movement event, which maybe does some miraculous go to the server like stuff, right? So over here in my scope, I have to say, okay, this do event is, I'm going to debounce it. So I'm going to do this underscore debounce, or you can use throttle. I don't, you pick which one you want to use. And I'm going to throttle at 200 milliseconds, okay? So that way it doesn't happen. If I'm mouse moving every millisecond, it's not going to do this method every millisecond. It's only going to do that every 200 milliseconds, right? Okay. So you're kind of right, but you're kind of wrong. So it's still going to come in here and run this method, which is an Angular method. And even though this debounce function is only going to run once every 200 milliseconds, you're still going to get a digest every time, every mouse move event. Okay? So you thought, oh, I'm being responsible. I'm going to throttle this off. You're still causing a digest even on the times it fires where low dash says, I'm not going to fire yet. I'm going to skip because I still haven't reached my 200 milliseconds. I'm going to skip. You still are doing a digest. Okay? That make sense? Okay. So be conscious of that. So my suggestion is to do something like this, which is your question earlier. Should we wire this stuff up on our own? So I'm like, yeah, this is my one-use handler, okay? So, and this all this guy does is he says, hey, do an element on mouse move, and when something that I care about happens, like maybe I'm within X pixels of the bottom, then do this scope eval and fire off my whatever the function was you passed to me, okay?
So the answer is make your own directive.
That's what I'm suggesting if you're in a big app, yeah.
So the fact that you have a directive on that DOM element doesn't automatically mean you're doing digest every time. Depends what's happening on your
Yep. Nope. Yep. So this directive, all I used it for up here, this test controller move handler. All he's doing is he's just adding a jQuery function, and that jQuery function, when something is true, then he'll say, okay, scope, evaluate whatever method that he passed in here. Go ahead and evaluate it compared to the main scope. Yeah.
That's completely living outside the realm. That callback is completely outside the realm of Angular.
Not really, because I'm evaluating. If when the thing is true, I tell Angular to evaluate this expression, which causes the apply.
Right, but the actual callback itself.
This function here.
Right.
Yeah.
The mouse move. That's just like a standard jQuery.
Just jQuery. And if you had 100 of these things on one page, maybe you do a delegate version of the same thing, where it only has one jQuery listener that's doing a delegate, but it can fire on multiple different scopes. You know what I'm saying? So that way you're even like uber efficient because you're not even wiring up multiple jQuery listeners. You're only one jQuery listener really, and it can access all the scopes to all the elements. Anyway,
Yeah, those inherent directives.
so I'm telling you, you can get artistic, and you can like hone your performance, but it's a thing you have to consciously do.
Is there a reason that Angular didn't, under the covers, provide a solution that would do just this? More like an NG mouse over?
Because
That's something.
it's harder. It would be so much less reliable if like and harder to program if we had to like care about this stuff. Like if I had to understand what the heck a digest is to use Angular, the popularity of the platform would still be like nothing. Like what's beautiful about it is I don't have to understand those things in order to do two-way data binding. I can only like at a high level conceptually understand what two-way data binding means, and I can use Angular. If I had to be you and understand digest, or if I'm me, I wouldn't have been able to get into Angular if we're being serious. So I think it was just like barrier entry to keep it low. But now we've evolved, right? So we can start doing other things to make our apps fast. So and that's what this is about. This is about, okay, we're past being good citizens in Angularville. Like now let's be excellent citizens in Angularville and show this off. So okay, I gotta keep going.
I think
We're up.
I think we're out of time, but
I've got a lot more stuff, so if anyone wants to stick around.
We have I reserved A Street. Sorry, Farmington Hills. We are going to do a hangout, but we reserved A Street room here in Boston for the next 2 hours to go over, to continue maybe with some of this if people want to continue with this topic, and then also to get into some of the style guides that we talked about yesterday.
Yeah.
And try to maybe have some interesting discussions around some conventions in our code. So we should probably migrate people who are interested as an optional thing for people who can and have time to attend. But yeah, we should migrate to A Street over in Building 30.
and there will be a Google Hangout for that as well.
Yeah, that kind of got a bunch of leads got that, and they can forward it to anyone who's interested. I just kind of sent it out to people that I knew that were doing Angular that were here, and I didn't actually send it to anyone in Farmington.
So we'll make sure that it gets over to Farmington to
they wanna.
everybody who wants access can get access to the Hangout. The other thing is people sitting up in the chairs in the front here. If you wouldn't mind helping stack up the chairs and clean up this area on the floor here.
I could try using this Hangout. I just don't know if when I move the wireless will drop. If it'll actually it might drop the Hangout, but
I think you have like time to rejoin.
Yeah.
rejoin it. Even if I'm the moderator,
I don't know what the YouTube thing's gonna do though.
Yeah. Anyway, so
We'll figure it out.
I have a different Hangout set up for us.
Figure it out in the next couple months. Thank you, everybody.
Just care if I hit this real quick.
We're going to go down there right now. I just need to go down there and all set it down. I'm set up a conference
There's a lot of guys, man.
Yeah, we do.
A lot of developers.
Hey, you brought a lot of people out. This is probably the biggest turnout that we've had, so it's all on
Oh shit, yeah, I'm Matt.
I'm Aaron.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll probably go to the next session, so I'll be there tonight.
Cool.
So it's talking about programmers that are doing Angular outside of the company. It's just
You guys
interesting to hear another company's approach and how they're.
Do you guys not have a lot of Angular people local? No, yeah, you do, because the groups, right?
Yeah, definitely. We do, but something I would say that last year there was only one team doing it. So it's gained a lot in the last 6 to 10 months.
Utah's like a mecca for Angular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For NGO, isn't it?
For Angular.
Oh.
Utah's like a mecca. Like we had one NG meetup, and it went to 100 and X people. So we had to start a second one in Salt Lake City, and they're both now at they're both breaking 3-digit numbers. And NG-Conf is there. And
Were you at NG-Conf in Salt Lake the last time?
Yeah.
I was there too. Yeah, I'm from Wyoming actually. That's where I was living.
Cool.
Yeah. So I think I remember seeing it there.
I actually was the MC. So you saw me on the stage.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's where I saw
Giving
it.
away all the stuff.
Yep.
make sure he knows where history is.
I don't know
Yeah,
where
yeah.
it is. Yeah,
I'm
so
coming.
Are you can, but you can stay in the chat.
No, I'm
or
good.
whatever. All right, come on.
John, I got
Yeah, you see, so you start with the other end. No, you have to up 1 core and 4.
That's good stuff. The one thing I found, memoizing your filter functions is a good way to get
Yeah, I've never done Memoize. I remember looking at it when I was like a young developer, and I couldn't wrap my brain around it, and I never came back. I'm sure I should use it.
It's